I've gathered that the i7-9700k is a somewhat popular chip, whether it be because it's the first 8-core consumer i7, or the follow-up to the enormous success that was the 8700k. This chip has staying power with people, similar to chips like the 2600k, 4790k, and the aforementioned 8700k. But how does this workhorse hold up after all these years? And is it worth considering a build on one of these once high-end processors? Before diving in, I wanted to say that this video isn't going to be my full 9700k review. That's going to take a bit more time to put together, but I more so wanted to explore some overall performance trends and take a look at if this chip is even worth roughly considering before we dive much deeper into the thing in a later video. Without anything else to really say, let's dive into this LGA 1151v2 processor and see what it offers. At first glance, this chip is relatively unassuming and looks like any other 9th gen part. I've seen the IHS look a bit different depending on which factory the chip has come out of, but by and large it looks very similar when comparing one of these Coffee Lake R chips to a base Coffee Lake one. The resistor and capacitor configuration on the bottom has changed on the slightly newer 9700K, but unless you're an electrical engineer, you probably aren't going to be paying too much attention to them. But they have changed or shuffled around a bit when moving up from the 8th gen parts, probably because there are more cores to power and shuffle data between. Physically speaking, the chip fits in the LGA 1151v2 socket, meaning that it only works on a Z300 series motherboard. Keep in mind though that you may need to flash the BIOS of a Z370 board to a more recent revision if you plan on utilizing a 9th gen part. The socket comes with support for all the now solidly last generation components, that being DDR4 memory, PCIe 3, and plenty of standard USB 2 and 3 Type A and Type C connectors and headers. For connectivity, the chip is definitely still able to keep up with other chips from the same time period, but if you're wanting PCIe Gen 4 and USB 4 Type C, along with more than typically 1 or 2 NVMe drives, then 12th gen Intel is where I'd look, or AMD's AM5 platform. With each of the 8 Skylake-derived Coffee Lake cores, you get a 64KB block of L1 data cache, 256KB of mid-level cache, and then a shared 12MB of L3 cache. This configuration is kind of restrictive by modern standards, where even i5s have over 20MB of L3, but for the time this was absolutely killer, and was basically top of the line in terms of latency and throughput. Keep in mind that while the caches in Skylake are a bit more restrictive than subsequent Cove architectures, the latencies on them are head and shoulders above comparable architectures from AMD and Intel, even up until this day. Skylake-based chips, including Kaby Lake, Coffee Lake, and Comet Lake, all feature the same base core architecture, and as such they achieve pretty consistent multi-core performance scaling with core count increases. But in some games that don't take advantage of the extra threads, you won't see a major improvement on the 9700K over something like a quad-core i5-6600K. This chip doesn't have hyper-threading, which even back in 2018-2019 was kind of concerning considering the cheaper AM4 Ryzen parts sported AMD's version of this tech, called simultaneous multi-threading. But when push came to shove, the i7 was, and still is, able to curb stomp AMD chips released around the same time frame when in gaming or latency-sensitive workloads. In fact, even comparing the chip to the much more modern and more powerful i7-14700K, the 9700K is strangely able to keep up in 2 out of the 5 preliminary games tested. So what about this chip makes it so appealing in 2024? Well, I'm not really sure I can give a specific answer, but what I can say is that the chip definitely has a lot going for it. Looking at specific benchmarks, Helldivers 2 and Cyberbug 2077 showed the largest gaps between the 9700K and its more modern current-gen sibling. Even looking at the 1% lows shows the 14700K achieving above what the 9700K is getting on average. But being 100% here, both of these chips are more than playable, and offer pretty decent performance when looking at them in their own bubble. But then in other titles that aren't known for being super demanding, such as X-Defiant and Apex Legends, the 9700K actually comes out slightly ahead of the 14700K on average, with the 9700K really showing off in the 1% lows in Apex. Other titles like Counter-Strike 2 and Modern Warfare 3 and Warzone perform very well when looking at it in a vacuum, but when you introduce the 14700K into the mix, it starts to fall behind by a noticeable margin. Without a doubt, the 9700K is still a very strong processor when given the chance to stretch its legs, Despite its solidly last-gen tech, it can still throw a punch and tackle both esport titles and much more CPU-demanding games, though admittedly at slightly diminished frame rates. Would I buy a 9700K in 2024 to build a new system around? Well, if you're getting the chip as a hand-me-down processor from someone else, then I'd take it and run because it's a great chip that can run current-gen games very competently. But if you're needing to buy one of these chips used, then the boards that support it are relatively inexpensive, but the price of the processor itself is kind of high, coming in at around $130 consistently on sites like eBay. For this price, I'd rather just go with an Alder Lake build and either save about $50 and get the same performance with a chip like an i3-12100, or alternatively you could spend the same amount of money and pick up an i5-12400, which will solidly outperform the 9700K. If you're interested in the 9700K and are curious about certain aspects of it, let me know in the comments and I'll definitely take a look at them for the full review of the chip, which is going to take some time because I just want to mess around with overclocking and see what I can do efficiency-wise with the thing. Get subscribed and leave a like on this video if you want that follow-up video, where I'll go more in depth with a wider variety of benchmarks and discuss some characteristics in more specific and direct manners. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. Let me know what you think about the 9700K, and if you'd pick one up in 2024. I personally would probably go to the more recent Alder Lake DDR4 build, but if you're eyeballing one or are currently on the chip, it's still a great processor that can tackle modern games and multi-core workloads. That's all I really have to say on the matter for now. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.